Go.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thanks again for the excellent attendance. And as everyone's aware, we're sort of shifting focus a bit this morning with a series of 3 lectures coming up on effectively green energy and new minerals and all the important stuff that we know about going on out there in the world. Today we have the good fortune to have Nils Backeberg. He has spoken to us before, so welcome, Nils. He's an active and important member of our group, lives down the road near Pearly Beach, and has a background in geology. He did an MSc at the University of Cape Town. He did some interesting work along the way. He's going to quite soon take us on a field trip to the False Bay Dikes and the Sea Point contact. And last year he put together a really fascinating field trip for us to Bali up in the Cedarberg to look at the Pockets Formation, and particularly some very interesting faulting in that sort of general vicinity. He also has a PhD from McGill University in Canada. He then worked for Roskill for quite some years, doing essentially mine-to-market analysis for new energy in the steel industry. And today he's going to talk to us about new critical and green mineral trends, what they really mean. Thanks, Nils, and over to you.
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me back again. So we're going to go into a session of 3 talks and effectively talking about what are some of the global trends, and these are all related to underpinned by climate change. And as geologists, we've been getting involved really along the supply chain side of things. What minerals are being impacted by global trends? What are the demand fundamentals that are driving these markets? So today's conversation is really going to be laying out, and there's like criticality, what is critical raw materials, what are the concepts behind there, really a geopolitical issue, green minerals, what does that mean? And what are some of the key trends? And then thinking about how that impacts different markets in general. And then really finish off with a bit of a slide where potentially saying a few things, but focusing in on South Africa, saying, so what are the opportunities here with regards to these trends? So let me just make sure this switches over. Just a quick background as to who I am. John, you said this nice. I'm from Cape Town, studied at UCT, and it sounds like I'll be taking you on a field trip for my master's projects in the False Bay Dikes form. But yeah, so really come from an exploration and structural geology fieldwork background. But then, life took me to London, and where I studied shales, and shales was not my favorite rock. And so I went into some commodity and supply chain analysis work for Roskill. And that's really why I'm talking today, because that work got me involved with understanding the fundamentals of supply chains and driven by downstream markets, and how technologies and global demand trends are changing, the structure as we see. So we've got a series of 3 talks coming up. So I'm really just going to bring into an introduction into the topic, and hopefully we can have a nice chat about a few key issues. And then we've got Clyde Madison talking to us about RSA clean energy options and the economics thereof. There's a part 1 in the series, and then Jock Harmer will be talking about new advances in clean energy technology. So really, you can see the focus here on clean energy, and all of us, we've been told it's stage 3 now, but I'm sure we're all expecting other stages again. So, it's quite a critical topic for South African perspective. What is South Africa doing in that? And I'm hoping we'll have a few more discussions over that over the course of the next few weeks. Right, so coming back to the topic of today, critical raw materials. What defines a critical raw material? So we've got just a quote here from the CRMA. So critical raw materials, CRMs, these are materials that are economically and strategically important, right? So related to the economic development in a country. So that's your point 1. So there's an economic importance to the metal. Examples are things like consumer electronics. These are large markets. Everyone's buying cell phones. Environmental technologies. This is where that link comes back into, green growth, carbon footprint, automotive, again, a massive industry, aerospace, important for global travel and space. You can add into that defense, military, so we've got unique applications, health, and steel is in here because steel really is a large industry. And so it has a huge, it accounts for about 9% of the carbon footprint. Right, so you've got these key sectors, and then specifically what makes a material critical is that they've got a high risk to supply, right? So because of the importance to the economy, a country will view a supply risk, or not just a country, a consumer will look at the supply risk of where do these raw materials come from. And then, so the definition for criticality here, or critical raw materials, is really where those minerals are not in a sustainable or secure platform, right? So there's a risk to that supply chain to be interrupted. And then specifically, what increases that risk is there's a lack of viable substitutes. So if that supply chain breaks down, you really are stuck. You can't switch to alternative technologies or alternative raw materials to feed that supply chain. So that's really what defines critical raw materials. And what's important here is it's a subjective view, right? So this is a map produced from a colleague of mine for his PhD, Jack Bedder, showing you, where's all the material, some of the key mine locations and countries for certain materials in here, so excluding things like gold. But you can see Brazil on the bottom left there, 90% of global niobium comes from the country. USA, you've got beryllium and helium. South Africa, you've got your PGMs in here as well. Could add chromium in here, which is sitting at about 60%. Cobalt in the DRC. And obviously the one that sticks out quite specifically here is China, with a very long list of weird and wonderful metals, but specifically the metals that are used in quite, we can add critical in here, but technology applications. And so this is really what forms the basis when a country goes in to assess its criticality strategy, right? So, and a lot of it is based around, like, we are reliant on importing not just raw materials, but downstream supply from China. And so China has built this dominance in this industry. And China, the strategy that China has built here is really governed by that. They've got these 5-year plans. They come out and they go in and they take over. One example was the steel industry, where during the global financial crisis, they incentivized their recovery by putting money into the steel industry. And now there's a complete overcapacity in there. There's certain issues that they are now addressing in the next stages of their strategies, but they account for over 50% of steel production and stainless steel production, because there's been these incentives. So China has been doing these strategies for a long time, and really Europe started publishing things about 2010, and the rest of the world is now catching up to these sort of narratives of critical supply chains. Right, so that map is looking at raw materials, so the geology. The geology really does underpin the fundamentals of your starting point in any supply chain that you're looking at. Right, but it's not just the geology, it's the whole supply chain as that. So if you look at chromium and manganese, you've got your ores and your ferroalloy supply, and then stainless steel is ultimately, well, steel and stainless is the end user for the supply chain. And then nickel, lithium, cobalt, these are your battery raw materials. And there's a whole suite of different industries or intermediates and technologies along the way before you get to your end product. And this is not even including your cell phone or your car at the India, which is the next step on. And then rare earths, just adding as an example, and you'll see now why I've added rare earths. We can plot maps into this. And so South Africa is an important player in some of these markets. Chromium, manganese specifically, it's the largest global supplier of the ores and concentrates. We used to also be the largest supplier of ferroalloys, but in line with the new energy topic that we'll be talking about, Eskom really is a key barrier to the industry in this country. And this is really what underpinned the growth in China, and China is now leading that market as well as the stainless steel industry. Right? So if you're looking at the criticality of ores and concentrates, from a China perspective, it is a highly critical element, because they are completely reliant on importing ores from South Africa to feed its ferroalloy industry. From the steel perspective, it is actually, chromium becomes less critical because they have the alloy production in country. Manganese, they produce more than enough manganese. They produce more than enough silicon alloys for their steel industry. Chromium is the last one where they are still importing a significant volume to meet their demand. right? So just using that example to illustrate how the criticality or the supply chain criticality varies based on where you're putting. And that's an important point to mention here when we start talking about sort of what's happening at the moment globally. So lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese, ores supplied from all over the world. Again, for manganese, South Africa has an important role to play. Chemical compounds, precursors, the whole supply chain is currently based in China. Originally, you'd have South Korea and Japan as key battery producers, but as the lithium-ion battery industry evolved, China really led that way and is the center of that industry. So even if you and now, this is the argument, if now Europe goes, okay, we want to have our own lithium-ion battery supply chain, they build a lithium-ion battery plant, they will still be reliant on the processed materials from China. So in order to actually diversify, you have to invest in a long stream across the supply chain and be able to build up sustainable and non-critical, if you will, i.e. to diversify that supply risk. So these become very, very complicated markets. And the one where we see a lot of the attention is in rare earths, right? So China is the largest producer of ores. That's changed somewhat, and we'll come back to that. But really, when it comes to the separation, the purification, the processing, and the final product, and even the end users, you've got the largest ore producer in China also builds MRI machines in the same area, right? So they really are integrated across the supply chain. So if you now want to sell an MRI machine, you also have to invest, or either you acknowledge that, okay, I need to get my supply sources from China. But if you want to diversify, there is a whole stream of investments required to do that. And that is really the key issue that we see, and where there's sort of a lot of misinformation with a lot of the reports coming out saying, USA diversifies its supply chain and gets, in-house rare earth magnet production. Okay, great. Now they've got the magnets. Where are those magnets being used and put into products? If we go a step further, we're still in China. So it really requires a long-term strategy. And this is exactly what China has been doing, and where the rest sort of the European strategies and US strategies are playing catch up to get there. And again, it's not a simple solution, because in any option, the interim, you are reliant on a supply chain with China. Right, and so as I've mentioned, the governments have gone out and published their strategies. This is becoming very key. So Europe's been publishing their critical raw materials technology since about 2010, I think, if not earlier. And they've got a nice list of what they find as the most critical material. So lead sits in here as the least critical. And that's mainly because lead has got a very well-established recycling supply chain, right? 90% of lead acid batteries or supply of lead into batteries comes from recycled supply. So it becomes effectively a closed loop, right? And you can see then as you go further to the left, the rare earths tend to outshine in this study. But really, it is still a subjective view. You need to remember that. It's not saying that rare earths is the most critical element. It may be so for many countries, but it really depends on your consumer base. And in this case, you've got oil refining for light rare earths. France is highly dependent on imports to produce some of these oil refining catalysts. I think it's a company called Solvay. And then so there's a complete reliance on the source of materials. Right, then you've got Canada, Australia, USA, China, Japan. They've all published strategies regarding critical raw materials, trying to identify what is critical from their front. Now, remember, as I said, it's a subjective conversation. Europe specifically, which is, mining in Europe is not a thriving industry, but the downstream consumer side of things is thriving. So they are reliant on imported raw materials. And so their strategy really has to be about that supply risk management. Now, Australia, you can see, has also published a critical minerals strategy, right? And for them, it's a different approach. Rather than being, the large steel producers or automotive producers, they actually have a resource base that can be used in the supply chain. So for them, it's more of a value opportunity. Where have countries identified critical raw materials, and how could that country support the diversification of these industries, right? Because as part of that diversification, a key narrative is sort of the environmental, social, and governance, the ESG aspect of these movements. So there's various approaches in here, and one of the key changes that we're going to see happening in here, sort of cost of production. You know, it used to be the cheapest producer survives, but we're really going to see that the consumer pressure on ethical sourcing, green supply, etc., that they are willing to pay for that. Now, you know, you've got then conflicts, global conflicts that jump in the way, like, you know, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, that will disrupt these trends, and certain conversations will take a back seat or a less of a priority. But the global climate change narrative really is the one that is underpinning a lot of this conversation. Ethical and green sourcing, or sustainable sourcing of raw material supply chains. Right, and so this is really the fundamental that's underpinning the drive. It used to be a subsidy-based industry, so governments trying to support these new technologies to come online, but it's really changing to becoming a consumer-driven market. Take electric vehicles as an example. You know, China had all these subsidies to get more electric vehicles on the market, and now it's become a self-fulfilling prophecy where people want to buy an electric vehicle even though it costs twice the price, if not more. Right? So this is really how these demand side of things are evolving. Right, and so just picking out two key trends that has really underpinned the last 2 decades, you know, steel, aluminium, just some of these well-known metals and elements that we see have really underpinned the growth. And if you look at that, it is the growth in China. So I haven't, on the left here, looking at crude steel, I haven't shown the China number in here. But this is from World Steel data, but, you know, over the last half a decade, you know, China accounts for over 50% of supply, and they've reached about 1 billion tons of output. I think it was in 2019, 2020. So you can see there we're approaching 2 billion tons. So China really has accounted for the growth here, and the same for aluminium industry. And this, a similar graph is representative of many, many industries that we see at this point. Right? And this is what has underpinned raw material markets, is the use of steel in construction, growth, automotives, etc. So how are these global climate change conversations changing that? Right? And that really is pinned around energy trends. Okay, so we've got this carbon, this fossil fuel environment that we're living in, and the climate change goals of limiting global warming to less than 2 degrees, significantly less. The Paris Agreement is 1.5 degrees by 2050, which seems unachievable in many cases when you look at some of these growth markets. And in order to meet that, we do need to see aggressive installations of new energy technologies or other sort of carbon restricting approaches. You know, the other way to do this is also to, you know, drop down demand. And so actually, as consumers, we do have a role to play in this conversation. You know, each and every one of us, our consumer behavior is important. If you just look at here, borrowing some data from Statistica, from the web, you know, you can see global car sales increase and actually peaked over 2017-18 and has started to decline. This is a consumer behavior approach. You know, Uber, shared driving, electric vehicles, okay, firstly, they're too expensive, people wanting to drive less, etc. And, you know, certain countries and cities, you don't recognize that. I mean, if you drive through Cape Town, you know, all the way through to Solari's Pass, congestion seems to increase every time. So maybe that's not true in certain regions, but globally we are seeing this trend, and that's a consumer behavior impact on the market. And you can see it's quite dramatic in terms of new vehicle sales on a global level. Right? So this will impact demand of things like aluminium and steel and all the other wonderful things. And then also has to look at car use to understand the oil consumption. So the automotive industry is one that we've really targeted to understand because it is such a large industry, and it's one where the consumer market is now very keen to see electrification take place. I want to drive an electric vehicle. And places like Europe and China are probably the best placed to make this happen because the infrastructure there of cities and energy grids is broad enough that they could probably charge up. And then things in the USA, the big question is range. Much like South Africa, if you get in your car here and you do a 2-3 hour trip, I recently had a friend come back from the USA, moved to Cape Town, and he asked where I was living. I was like 3 hours from Cape Town. He was like, oh, cool, that's much shorter than he thought. Whereas if you ask most Cape Townians, anything longer than 20 minutes is far away. So there is that behavior regional that's important, that will drive the energy markets. So what are we seeing on top of just energy consumption and use in automotives? We've got, so at the bottom here, this is your EV penetration. It's still very, very low, but it is accelerating. So we're seeing that. So this is changing raw material markets. Solar technology, and you can, there's growth in these markets coming in here. Wind capacity is increasing rapidly. And so here you're just showing you the size of wind turbines as they've changed. And here we've got these 13 to 15 megawatt turbines coming up. These are our options for renewable energy to build those in, but they are also raw material intensive to use and to set up, not to mention the infrastructure behind it. Right. So what are some of the trends regarding energy transition technologies, and starting to have a look at within these energy transitions, what those raw materials mean, what the growth looks like? So we've got lightweighting and motors. This is really looking at transportation, right? So aluminium's important, substitute for steel. You've got the replacement risk of steel here and other alloys. From a lightweighting perspective, the aerospace industry, the lighter the planes are, the less costly it is to fly in terms of oil consumption. Right? So copper's involved in anything. If you talk about technology and an energy transition narrative, copper's involved. I've got barium and rare earths in here. There's part of the magnets and the motors, and there's a variety of others sitting in there. So the replacement risks that we're seeing in these markets are steel, the alloys associated with that, and oil consumption. But so coming back to ESG concerns, so environmental, social, and governance, this is a very important part that's part of the current narrative. Right? So this is this being done ethically and sustainably from a social, a governance, and an environmental perspective? And with these large markets like automotives, etc., it's the large scale requirements of mining to meet demand. That is one of the largest concerns. It's like there's a lot of rock required to be moved and mined in order to get these materials. Right. And then we've got batteries and energy storage. That's sort of a topic in its own and a key narrative. And here you've got your lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese, graphite, vanadium, etc. The narratives of these new energy battery technologies going in here, and every element on the periodic table is trying to get a piece of this pie. You've got antimony in there, which is used in molten metal batteries with calcium. These need to operate at high temperatures to keep everything molten, and so there's other issues to overcome, but everyone's looking at how can these best be implemented. Some of these molten metal technologies might be useful for a grid scale, depending on that. Vanadium redox is a key example and a key competitor, or that's trying to come onto the markets against lithium-ion batteries for grid scale problem, but they have a much larger footprint for the batteries, but they are less risky. Lithium-ion batteries tend to explode or have these runaway thermal reactions, and that causes big health safety issues. And that's one of the key issues related to the battery narrative and why cobalt is so important for the chemistry. Right, replacement risks here: lead, tin, antimony, and all sort of lead acid battery type materials. And the major concerns is ethical sourcing. We've got this drive for new energy technologies and energy storage, but child labor and the DRC associated with cobalt. We've got a lot of the supply chain saying, I want to buy the battery, but know that this has been done ethically. Right, and then technology and other renewable energies, again, rare earths is a key component in this, and all of the sort of EM suite of elements, miniaturization and optimization, and improving efficiency. There's all sorts of research and development. It's a very exciting area that's in there. And this is really where we are going to see new technologies come in and out and define future demand trends, right? So it depends on the technology landscape. These are very opaque industries. Some of these are small markets, and can something like germanium enter the automotive industry? It's very hard for germanium to be a mainstream product given the scale of its industry, you really have to invest in the technologies there. So besides just going a green energy, you have to look at the sustainable way that this can be done, given the infrastructure that's in place. So that adds an important side. So I'm just quickly going to do a quick spotlight on rare earths, because it is a key example. So here you're just looking at production of rare earths in the USA and China and other. You see US was one of the key suppliers from the Mountain Pass mine, but then China really managed to flood the markets. Mountain Pass became unsustainable. There was a lot of illegal mining in this period here. But then the supply in China declined because China's strategy now changed to cleaning up environmental issues, and such as illegal mining, and you can see the rest of the world's supply coming back, right? But as I showed in that one of the earlier slides, China, the downstream market's all in China. So most of this, including the supply of the US, is being imported into China. So it really is a key example where over this period, China's invested in the downstream industry, and now it's not too concerned about using only its own resources in the ground, effectively exporting its carbon footprint or environmental footprint by taking imported raw materials, but processing them in its established downstream industry. And one of the key trends that is underpinning rare earths is its use in magnets, and the magnets use in motors, right? Motors, electric motors required for an electric vehicle, right? There used to be, or the other technology used was the induction motor. Really, that was the Tesla's namesake technology. But if you throw in a permanent magnet motor, which is shown here from General Motors, where all these little slots in the drivetrain here, this is where you put in all your little magnets. And by using permanent magnet motors, specifically neodymium, iron, and boron magnets, you increase in efficiency of about 30%, i.e. you're getting more out of your energy demand. So Tesla has also switched now to using permanent magnet motors, but that has opened up Tesla's supply chain risk to Chinese markets. And so you can see the forecasts here. This is one borrowed from CRU, where they're looking at their EV forecasts, and effectively you see the growth is coming from that magnet material in electric vehicles, right? This image at the bottom here, so the flat motor, what they're actually doing is they're starting to put even larger magnets into the motors, turning the direction of flux. And so you can get even stronger motors by adding more magnets. So at the moment, rare earth magnets are the key technology to get the most energy out of your batteries, i.e. the most cost-effective way to do that. And the only way to do that at the moment, and to improve that, is currently to put more rare earth magnets in it. We are seeing alternative technologies using cheaper ferrite magnets and loading a chock-a-block full of magnets. But then again, that's not efficiency in terms of weight. So when we're talking about mobility, weight is important. And for an automotive vehicle where you're putting $400 or $2,000 of rare earth magnets into the car is really not the biggest issue when you compare that to the cost of the battery. Right, and so bringing this back to supply chain and criticality, this is a map that I made for Roskill back in the days from 2018, looking at the rare earth landscape. And you can see really everything links back and around into China. The rare earths is not a rare deposit. Talking to Grant earlier, where we worked on the Zandkopfdrift deposit here, close to Garis. And then Steenkampskraal being sort of the other well-established project. There's a lot of resources in South Africa in these two deposits, not to mention in Southern Africa. Ngwala is one that's been advancing quite long, and Songwe. And Gakara in Burundi is one that came online, where they exported run of mine, if you will, or direct shipping, what they called it. Basically, they broke off a rare earth vein and exported it to China. And you see all of the supply chain is closely linked into that. Australia being one of the key outliers, but one of the issues with rare earths is its association with thorium. And you can see Australia has exported its material to Malaysia, where it actually then processes that material and does the separation. A lot of the light rare earths went into France and then into the rest of the Western world, but still a lot of it went back into China because there was no downstream market for those outside of China. Despite Lynas here being one of the largest producers of rare earths, or the largest producer of rare earths outside of China. Right, and then it's a bit of production in Russia that comes into Europe, but really just small scale and focused on light rare earths. And then here, this is the Mountain Pass mine that went offline, came back online under joint ownership of a Chinese company, and is all being exported to China into the main processing region up here using its bastnäsite ores. Right, so when we talk about US and Europe trying to diversify its supply chain, it becomes very difficult. There's several steps along the way. We just had an announcement a few days ago that one of the auto parts producers, Schaeffler, they want to start getting rare earth oxides from a company that set up operations in Norway, but they're using material from, I think, Nichelacho as their project. So there's diversification. And now they've got the oxides, right? But now they need to go and process those further, do the separation and produce the magnets. And then they've got the magnets. And so that's their plan. But in order to do that, they need to start competing with the well-established industry in China that is exporting a lot of its magnets or even motors, finished made motors into Europe. And part of that conversation, VW in Europe, they've built their EV drivetrain plants in China because that's where the supply chain is sitting. Right? Okay, so to finish off, I just wanted to put this up and have a bit of a conversation back into like where is South Africa in some of these key trends. And I limited myself to the flag colors in terms of what elements to talk about. So just no specific order, starting with gold, South Africa being one of the key historical gold narratives globally, but its global position shrunk, and also we had a gold session not too long ago here, and related to heap leaching technologies and then that going outside. South Africa is sitting with deep mines, higher costs, but also specifically South Africa is lacking in mining investment. And you see Paul Miller posts quite a lot of stuff on LinkedIn talking about where this is all going wrong, etc. So this is a narrative in its own that we can talk about. In terms of energy transition outlook, what's the purpose of gold? It's linked to the global economy. People are talking about a threat of its actual function because of things like Bitcoin. But I guess we'll all believe that when we see it. What's the opportunity in South Africa? And linking this back to the talks we had previously, Barberton, is there an opportunity in Barberton to actually add a new gold supply stream into South Africa? PGMs, South Africa leading from the Bushveld. Same lack of investment conversation, but the same companies have been operating there. They are expanding. There's very few new operations coming online. In terms of its demand view, the problem is its decline in vehicle catalyst demand. At the moment, it's still increasing because the restrictions on pollution control are becoming more strict. So they need to put more PGMs into these catalysts or more catalysts into the motors. But the industry is really waiting for the hydrogen economy to come online. And then that will be a key point. So, South Africa has an option here to be a leader in the hydrogen economy. And you've got people like Anglo American, investing in their sort of hydrogen fuel cell truck fleet. Effectively, I thought this was a very clever move. Starting to build their own demand market. They're mining it out of the ground and creating their demand markets. Chromium and manganese. Again, South Africa is a major supplier. Issues, export of unbeneficiated ores. There's lots of conversation on export tax. Manganese, remote, Transnet has always been behind the scale of the industry. And again, Eskom is one of the major issues. I'll address that here in the middle part. Steel industry, slowing down, but stainless steel still good. Manganese, exposure to batteries. So what is this opportunity for South Africa? How will an export tax impact the market? Is that a good or a bad thing? I think those are conversations to have with exporting the ores. How can we support local supply chains? And we are one of the key producers of manganese metal outside of China through MMC. And this is a key option for the battery industry to use. In the ferroalloy industry, energy intensive, Eskom has just been the biggest headwind for this industry, but demand from Chinese steel is going to slow. Is it too late to regain a leadership in this market? Is it worth investing in that as the sort of energy supply chain starts to reshift? Steel is still going to be a key part of the global economy. So I wouldn't argue that it's too late, but there's certain cost disadvantages that are really now become issues. So Eskom a key problem. And then at the bottom here, I'll leave these open a bit more for discussion. you know, what are the resources that we have in South Africa? They're relatively limited, rare earths being an exception to that. Yes, we've got nickel coming as a byproduct from PGMs, but it's not large. There's not enough volumes of nickel to support the chromium supply in terms of building a domestic stainless steel industry, not to mention energy consumption, right? But, you know, maybe there's opportunities in batteries, and really, you know, battery material growth is one of the key opportunities, especially given South Africa's position in sort of research and development. Mintech is highly involved in some of these markets in terms of developing technologies and working with industries, including the hydrogen economies, the hydrogen fuel cell technology. So they're really involved in that. And so for all of these, you know, South Africa may not be sort of in its traditional sense the main source of raw materials, but it does have an opportunity here to become sort of a hub and a steward for Southern African resources, working with its neighbors and actually, you know, leading technology and applications and getting a piece of this pie of the new energy transition. Yeah, so I'm going to leave it there and leave the slide up for comments, debates, disagreements, and grievances. So thank you. I hope I'm still online.
Thanks, Nils. Okay. Interesting stuff. Let's get the questions going. Maybe I can just ask the first question to Jock. Jock, have you heard anything more about progress on Steenkamp-Skraal? You there? Jock Harmer.
Sorry, yeah, I was trying to find the button.
Okay.
No, I haven't heard anything back from Steenkamp-Skraal at all. I thought you might have.
Yeah. You know, we must follow up with Trevor and see what they're actually doing.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, Steenkamp-Skraal is a very interesting situation, and I think a bit to their detriment. You know, they've marketed themselves as a thorium project, then a rare earth project, and then a thorium project again. Yeah. But it really does illustrate one of the key issues, not necessarily the fact that it's thorium and the handling of it is possible, but the social sort of understanding of the industry when they hear radioactive materials.
Agreed. Pete, I see you've got your hand up. Pete Siegfried.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that, Niels. I'm interested. Recently, Australia has put in quite a lot of funding and research, both private as well as state-sponsored, for looking at potential of developing the monazite, which is traditionally a byproduct of the heavy mineral sand industry, of which Australia is so much part of today's heavy mineral world produces. Given the production of heavy mineral sands in Southern Africa, and specifically the West Coast in South Africa, are you aware if there's anything of similar coming within the sort of South African context?
Yeah, so the similar coming, I mean, there are so many rare earth projects out there, right? So to say that something's coming online, I think is going to be a stretch, because the market is not yet big enough that, you know, if one of these producers comes online, as we've seen, the Enyaba project in Australia, you know, producing byproduct heavy mineral monazite, really fills a significant gap. These are large volumes of materials mined and large stockpiles of tailings, effectively, right? So first off, in order to understand the heavy mineral sand side of things, right, the monazite is the key mineral that's coming out of it. So again, you're dealing with thorium as part of this conversation. And last time I looked into this from a Chinese perspective, is that there's actually only one legal route for monazite from heavy mineral sands to enter the market, and that's together with their atomic agency, right? So they actually then take out the thorium, and then it feeds back into the rare earth industry. So there's a limited supply chain on that side, even on the Chinese side. You know, I think they were importing material from Madagascar, There's about 8,000 tons of monazite concentrate that leaves there every quarter. I don't know if that's still happening. But then specifically, yeah, that Inyaba project is looking to ramp that up. And they've chucked a whole lot of money to improve the refining of that, right? And again, that needs to come with the thorium understanding and how they're dealing with that. And that's always been the big question. So what's coming out of Southern Africa? I think, it's not just necessarily looking at these heavy mineral sands. We're also seeing conversations of these phosphates deposits, looking at byproducts coming out. And I think, yeah, it depends on what materials coming up. The supply chain is established to consume monazite and bastnasite in terms of its volume. So if you have any other rare earth mineral coming out, you've already got a back step, because you need to develop that supply chain, or that flow chain in terms of processing. But I think the key point here is that rare earth projects will most likely come online, in my opinion, if they're sort of byproduct related, right? Because the market is so restricted in terms of Chinese control, in terms of what's required, depending on the demand in China. If things in China shut down, then that's the same for anyone who supplies into that. So there's still that restriction in it. So if you are solely reliant on rare earth income, I think it's going to be very difficult to come online.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Nils. Gerard, and just before we go to you, Gerard, just to say that all of our presentations go onto YouTube and will be available on YouTube in a day or two. So you can go and get back to them and re-listen to them, or listen at your leisure. You can find them on the GSSA YouTube link. Or we do put them out in our newsletters. But to answer a question, yes, all of these presentations are on YouTube and freely available. Gerard, you've got your hand up.
Thank you, John, and Nils, thanks for a very informative presentation. I'm looking forward to the next two. Maybe you're going to address it in those discussions, but you've made it quite clear that the rare earth process is quite complex. The first extraction, separation, and then the magnets. It's worth noting that there's a South African company in Pretoria who has developed the neodymium fluoride process, or they've done the process flow sheet to produce neodymium fluoride. Neodymium fluoride is needed in the melting process. Once you've got the oxides separated, it's used as a flux. So that's quite noteworthy. I'm not sure if you're aware of that.
No, I'd be very keen to, if you could pass on some details, and I'd be very interested to read about that.
Yeah, there was an engineering news article, October. I will forward that to you. You've also referred to Scheffler working with a company in Norway. That company, Retech, yes. It's interesting, they've set up their facility inside the Yara fertilizer yard. So their raw material is phosphate. So I think that bodes well for our phosphate resources.
Yeah, but the last thing I heard there is that they're actually looking to talk to Vital Metals and actually use Nechalacha material from Canada.
Okay, right.
So, but yeah, these supply chains, this is one of the key issues. Can they use phosphate raw materials? And it's a large potential market.
It is huge. Afrimat in South Africa is exploring that avenue.
Yeah.
The one other critical issue is the licensing for the magnet. As far as I know, majority of the automotive industry use the Hitachi license for the magnets. So that's also quite a critical issue. But even a company like Wackenschmelze in Germany uses the Hitachi license. So it is complex to put this value chain together, but I think it's worth pursuing for South Africa. If you think about the concentration risk and the geopolitical risk that rare earth are faced with, there should be really a lot of merit in South Africa looking into the complete value chain.
No, Gerrit, I think it's a fantastic comment and absolutely right. And important to remember that each step in the supply chain is not simple, but there are existing technologies, and the patent landscape is complex in its own way. That there are a few key patents around there, and the technologies, that happens to be the magnet of choice at the moment, right? And they've been researching this for a long time to get on top of that. So this seems to be the landscape that's being used. So you're absolutely right there. And at the other stage, Mintech's got a pilot plant of separating rare earths that can operate. Right, I've seen neodymium powder sitting there on their lab tables. So it's there. The technology is there to do that, and then it's about moving that forward. I think another key narrative. Again, one does have to keep addressing the thorium issue, because there's the demand market for thorium is not there. If you deal with rare earths en masse in this way, the demand market's not on there. And China, again, is leading this way in terms of thorium reactors. There was some news articles showing that they're really putting some money into the development of thorium reactors, nuclear energy. So, and I think if that comes to fruition, then all of a sudden, these rare earth byproduct thorium becomes a real conversation globally. But again, China's leading the way there.
Thank you, Nils. May I just follow up? You did not mention silicon. Is that going to be in a future presentation as a very crucial mineral for solar PV and the Chinese?
Exactly. So silicon. When we've done a fair bit of work on silicon back in the Roskill days, and from a geology perspective, it's not considered rare. Everyone sort of gets domestic material. This does not become true when you look at high purity quartz, and that becomes a completely different conversation. And that industry is quite difficult to put apart. But you're absolutely right. Silicon's a key component in solar industry for glass making, as is antimony. Antimony gets rid of all the bubbles and makes the efficiency better, right? So that's it. That is a key industry, but the silicon industry is dominated by steel, and there it is not considered a critical raw material in terms of its ability. So it does get a bit of the unsung mineral at the moment. It does have key application potential in lithium-ion batteries as well, on the anode side. Those could be future markets. So like I said, I think all these elements are looking at different things, but in terms of PV, it's already well established. It's not a new market. It's just relatively small compared to the established silicon industry.
Okay, great stuff. Do you want to unload your stuff yourself, Nils, and we can see you? And Gerrit, just a comment back to you. I mean, what you're talking about and what Nils is talking about in South Africa, we have this jewel box. We've got just about all of these things, but who's going to go and talk to Gwedi Mantashe and the ministry and start developing enabling mineral policy? I mean, I don't know if all of you have seen the latest Fraser Institute report about the uninvestability of minerals and mining, of the minerals and mining set up in South Africa. It's actually quite worrying, and we've had discussions on that before. But those points are really something we should be addressing as well. And second point, just for interest, is that I think it's next month. There'll be 2 talks on silica, including our exceptional silica deposits that we have down at Philippi on the Cape Flats, and what's happening there, and how that amazing resource is being strangled by sort of unplanned development. And we all know what's going on the Cape Flats and the huge unsustainable influx of people. But that's for another presentation. And Stephen Davey will be talking on that. He's done some great work on the industrial minerals of the Western Cape. Okay, Bruce Williamson. Sorry, we've kept you waiting, Bruce.
Morning, John. Thanks very much. And hi, Nils. Nils, earlier on, when you were referring to sort of ESG and that consumer demand has now come to the fore and driving sort of EVs, as an example. but you also showed that the penetration is pretty low. So I think it was 2.3%. And my guess is that this demand is driven by sort of more wealthy, rich, elitist people. With metal prices sort of high, and I might even sort of say exorbitant, how are we going to make sure that there's a second, third level of demand that really gets these new products into the market? I'm just a little bit concerned that we might now stall and then everything is set back.
And that's a great comment, Bruce, and I think that's absolutely right. You know, the sort of supply chain volatility, nickel disruptions to the market because of Russian conflict in Ukraine, and all sorts of, all of these narratives will impact the downstream side of things, because they'll go, oh my God, my supply risk here is too high as changing geopolitical issues come into play, right?
Yeah. And I mean,
in terms of, just to answer the question, in terms of, how will the demand side evolve? And it is a conversation of scalability, right? So cost of production, economies of scale, that is how we get it. And we've had these incentivized approaches to do that through government subsidies to start. And so that supply chain is starting to evolve, and we're seeing the consumer drive to join into that. So it will, the forecasts currently are sort of suggesting that is starting to roll over. Specifically also with the decline in other vehicle demand, we're going to see costs rise for a normal combustion engine vehicle, not just because of taxes and pollution standards, but because of demand dropping down, and that goes the wrong way. But effectively, they're not recuperating their costs on the low sales that they're getting. So there it becomes an issue of the decline in revenue for these existing supply chains. That'll become another issue. So yeah, it's the economies of scale is the only way to really do this. And so this is where we've seen these incentivized investments into these industries support that. But you're absolutely right. These shocks to the system will cause breaks, will cause halts. And the only thing that really will underpin the sustained drive is global climate change narratives. Do we need to do this? And I think that's the conversation that will keep bringing it to the forefront.
Yeah, good. And I mean, further on, you showed how China is just probably a decade ahead of everyone else. They have just now controlled that full supply chain. And if you look at wind equipment, solar equipment, battery storage equipment, everyone's going to go to China, and then they have the population to meet that demand, and therefore they become even more scalable. And the West is just losing ground, in my opinion. And now we've got central banks going to hit us with ever higher interest rates. It just seems crazy.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the Chinese strategy and policy is now turned from we used to talk about made in China 20 years ago in terms of things that we bought with a certain understanding of what the quality was. Now it's completely changed. It's like made in China for China. So they really are focusing on improving quality and being leading developers of technology and quality. It's quite fantastic to see, when you go visit in China and see what these plants are doing. Even the ferrochrome plants or an antimony plant, which is well known for its polluting nature and being quite dirty, small, and illegal. The big producers in China have built some beautiful operations to the highest standards.
Right, good. Thanks very much.
Tabedi, you got your hand up? Tabedi Ramunja.
Okay, thanks, John. And thanks, Nils, for the excellent presentation. I just want to get your comment on this possible extraction of rare earths from coal. If you take into consideration all the debates about phasing out of thermal coal, to address climate changes and all those things. What is your view? What is your view about that? And I mean, also maybe let me just talk about this global political situation, which is now changing. I mean, if you look at what's going to happen post the Russia-Ukraine scenario, don't you think that the West will sort of revisit issues relating to this Paris Agreement and Glasgow Agreement, and all these issues of trying to say we will move with speed to address a global warming and move into renewables is going to slow down in a very big way, because all the scenarios were based on accessing energy from China. I mean, from Russia. Thank you.
Yeah, Tiberi, there's some loaded questions in there, but so starting off with rare earths and coal. I mean, yeah, the US, the DLA, no, not DLA, one of the departments. I think Gordon Summers was one of the guys leading the research in rare earth recovery from coal, and they've got a similar situation. There's years of tailings, decades of tailings sitting there, centuries probably, that becomes an effective source, and the rare earth concentration in that is very low. So to establish a scalable recovery of rare earth suitable for the industry that will require high material movements. Yes, it's dealing with tailings, so it actually ticks off one of the ESG boxes. It's not new mined material, it's waste material. So that is in its benefits. So and it's basically a race between the different types of supplies, because we won't see, well, won't necessarily, I say won't, right? It's a forecast, but we will unlikely see phosphates and coal and heavy mineral sands come to market, because the rare earths industry is not big enough to need that. And if you do that, then the market's going to be oversupplied, and these suppliers won't be able to operate. The key point here is that some of them will be byproducts, and so for them they can probably survive. So that's the key issue to think about then. So how much material is coming out? If you want to make a coal tailings operation economical, the scale of that's going to be massive. How much rare earths you're going to pump out to that, and how is that going to impact the supply chain? And will you then still get your money for it? I.e., was it worth it? Or are you going to shut down for liquidation purposes? So I think that's the key issue to do. I mean, so we are all, there's all these weird and wonderful approaches for rare earths being researched, and there's a lot of opportunities out there, but you have to look at how does it fit into the existing supply chain, i.e., can you cooperate with China to make it work, to get it off the ground? To build a completely independent supply chain from the ground up is a massive undertaking. Right, addressing climate change, if they're going to rethink their stances, and I think fundamentally, in order to get renewable energy, requires investment, requires mining of these new materials, and so it comes with a carbon footprint that needs to be part of the conversation. And does accelerating it help us get there, or maybe you're implying that because of the war, maybe it's not worth investing in certain things. Just make sure that we have energy and can keep the lights on. Some Europeans are getting the feel of load shedding to some extent. I mean, I'm not going to try and answer that question, because I don't think I'm qualified to do so specifically from a climate change perspective. But I think it's an important conversation to have. It's like, how will the energy narrative continue? And fundamentally, I think the drive comes from the climate change narrative, and that's not going away. We're seeing climate responses, and people are becoming more and more in tune with, like, oh, things have changed compared to 10, 20, 50, 100 years ago. So I think it's becoming aware that that the consumer market is becoming more aware of the impacts potentially. And it's a very much a philosophical answer there, so I apologize.
Yeah, I mean, just coming back to that, Nils, I mean, I think the key thing is the point you made very early on at the start. It all goes back to consumer behavior. If we really want to clean up our environment, just look around us. Let's start respecting the environment and cleaning it up. I mean, if you look at this lovely area we live in, I mean, the litter and the waste and the trash is just frightening. And until we as consumers or, you know, human beings start changing our attitudes, you know, there's not a lot that's going to change. Gerard, just to probably end off with you, thanks. We've had a great discussion, so well done, Nils. Gerard, you've got your hand up again, or was it an old hand?
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment if there's still time, because Bruce was referring to the penetration of electric vehicles and how could that demand be continued and stimulated to accelerate it. The slide that Nils showed goes up to 2019, if I recall, and the penetration there was 2.5%. In 2020, it was already at 4%, and 2021 was 8.4%. So there's a steep uptake for electric vehicles. I think it's a matter of how quickly the Tesla type vehicles can be manufactured in the world. The South African industry is really in trouble. We export to UK, for instance, the Mercedes-Benzes. 2030, they won't allow any ICE vehicles into UK. So the next model that that Mercedes has to produce from South Africa has got to be an electric vehicle. So there's huge pressure and growth and demand growth, both from consumer choice and inflation. Thanks.
That's a good point. That the regulation is really an important feature that's, you know, limiting. So there are going to be taxes or duties put onto the entire automotive industry. They have to say my entire fleet, you know, this is its carbon intensity, and then based on where they sit, they will pay fines according to that. But Gerrit, those numbers in terms of 2019 and 2020, you have to be very careful in interpreting those, because you're looking at a decline in the automotive new vehicle sales. So the EV penetration rate there is not accelerating relative. It has to do as well with the decline in the overall automotive sales, which is an important point to make. It's not just an acceleration in demand there. There's a bit of a slowdown in some extent in China because they took away the incentives, but then that consumer behavior came back into play and the growth continues. But yeah, so the growth does come from the penetration rates. And, you know, Tesla's moved, the Model 3 was the whole point of that technology was, okay, we've had this elite vehicle. Now we need something that's a bit more larger scale, cheaper. And this is why they went to rare earth permanent magnets, because they could reduce the cost of the battery by using more efficient motors. So yeah, so there's many narratives in here that will support the drive for demand, and it seems to be that we've gotten onto this train, and we'll see how geopolitics can upset that or not.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic, Nils. Thanks everyone for the lively discussion, and I guess this has really set up the following two talks really well. So thanks, Nils. Thanks everyone for your contributions. And as I said, this talk will be on YouTube in a couple of days, and we look forward to the next presentation or set of presentations from Clive Mallinson and Jock Harmer. Thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you all. See you next week.
Thanks, Nils.
Thanks, Nils.
Yes,